AM Agenda with Kieran Gilbert.
Good morning and welcome to the program. A big week in politics, more debate about the budget, good debt versus bad debt, the efforts to guarantee domestic gas supplies as well. Lots to talk about with Peter McGoran, former Howard Government Minister, and Ben Oquist, former Greens advisor, now Executive Director at the Australia Institute. Ben, first to you, what do you make of this notion of good debt versus bad debt? Does it help in explaining that now is actually a good time to be taking on debt, rates at record lows, to be building much-needed infrastructure around the country?
Well, it's welcome that finally we have an end to the myopic war on debt and deficit for the sake of it. And it's an acknowledgement from the Treasurer, something that the Australia Institute has been arguing for some time. Actually, there's a case for more debt in certain circumstances in Australia now, for those two reasons. One, that interest rates are at record lows, so it's a good time to be borrowing money. And two, there are big infrastructure needs, particularly in our cities that have been groaning under the weight of increased population, and the infrastructure hasn't been keeping up. But one hopes it's not an excuse for the Treasurer to cut spending in areas that he says aren't good, aren't good infrastructure. Now, there's a mismatch here. The Treasurer has been leaking stories to the paper attacking welfare payments to the unemployed that take up a minuscule amount of the budget, some 2%, and we just got to hope that this is an excuse for more cutting and spending. But we do need more infrastructure. We do need more debt to finance it. So it's a good sign that it's an end of that, as I said, myopic war on debt and deficit for the sake of it.
If we put to one side your fears about welfare and that sort of recurrent spending, what about the idea that a government would build and run and operate the Western Sydney Airport? If the Sydney Airport Corporation doesn't take up its first bid to run, which it has that right, by early May, the government, according to government sources being reported around the place this morning, will build and operate it itself. What do you think of that?
Well, it's amazing, isn't it? We are coming to the acceptance that it's not always just the private sector that should be doing these things. Sometimes it's better for the public sector to do them, and it's a recognition of that. And it may be the most appropriate way to go. But what we don't want to see in this budget is good debt going after bad projects. And my big worry remains that this government is thinking of putting $1 billion loan to help facilitate the Adani mine, what would be the world's biggest export coal mine in the world. Now, if you're talking about good and bad debt is going after projects that aren't in the long-term interests of this nation, in a declining coal market, that don't make good sense environmentally or economically. Nobody thinks that coal is going to be the dominant source of energy in 100 years' time or 60 years' time, which is the life scale of such a project. So while it might be appropriate for the government to be involved in big infrastructure that serves a long-term national interest, it's certainly not in the interests of the nation for it to be involved in big infrastructure for a big Indian mining company.
Before I go to Peter McGoran, the idea of the Melbourne to Brisbane rail link, these various ideas that have been called for some time, if this is able to open up that sort of infrastructure, productivity enhancing infrastructure like that, and to have public support for it, as you say, it ends that endless debate about the debt and deficit issue, particularly when right now economists, and you've said it yourself, the RBA governor has been calling for some time investment in this productivity enhancing infrastructure while rates are low. It just makes sense. I guess at a household level people get it. Now this might help a broader political debate and message on this, Ben.
Indeed. It is an amazing turnaround, isn't it? We had Malcolm Turnbull appearing famously in front of those debt and deficit trucks. We've had this government railing against Labor's debt and deficit. But for a long time, economists have been saying that actually now is the time to be building that long-term infrastructure, and there's a big role for a government to play in it. So if that is the case, I think that's a very sensible move for the government. It'll be good for them politically. It's good economically, and obviously it's good for the nation in the long term. But it takes government involvement. It takes government planning to build and support that infrastructure, and it's a return to the government being at the centre of these things, and that's a good thing.
I'll get to Peter McGoran for that coalition view in a moment. We're just having some technical issues with his studio link from Melbourne, Ben, but we'll stay with you and talk about the other big issue of the week in terms of government policy, and this was the mechanism in terms of safeguarding domestic supply of gas. Do you like what you see in this regard? If the gas producers don't provide enough sufficient and low-cost gas supply, well then the government will enforce this mechanism that it announced yesterday.
Well, this export gas industry does need taking on. For too long, they've held sway over politics. It's worth going back to 1998. I was working in the Senate at the time when export controls were removed by the Howard government. Warwick Pera was the minister at the time, and they removed the power of export controls on the gas industry. It was a mistake to remove those powers, so it's good that they've been put back in. It's still not clear, though, what the government's actually going to do. They're going to give themselves the power, but are they going to actually do anything? And the Prime Minister himself getting into a bit of a pickle yesterday about whether he would be halving gas prices or he wouldn't. But that export gas industry needs taking on. And the disappointing thing, I think, out of yesterday, that this announcement masked the fact that the government has dropped the other big lever that they need to be putting on the gas industry, and that's been the review of the PRRT tax that goes on, the profits tax that goes on the gas exporters. And the government's quietly shelved that review and is not going to bring that forward in the budget. Now, Australia is set to become the world's biggest exporter of gas. By 2021, we'll be exporting more gas than Qatar. Now, Qatar in that year is going to make $26 billion in royalties from the exports of its gas. Now, it's estimated by Treasury now that Australia will be bringing in only $800 million from the PRRT in that year. And we are not getting a return on that gas we should. We've killed the domestic gas market, if you like, opened up a huge export market that has increased the price of gas, and we're not getting a return on it. The Australian Institute warned back in 2013 in a big report cooking up the price of gas that the price of gas would triple or maybe go up 4 times because of the opening up of the export gas market. It's happened as we predicted. Meanwhile, we're not getting the tax return as a nation that we should be on these gas exports, and the Treasurer should review his decision to not bring forward that PRRT review and have it implemented in this budget.
We will hopefully have Peter McGoran with us after the break, the former Howard Government Minister, to join Ben Oquist and I. Stay with us on AIM Agenda this Friday.
Internet too slow? Then put a rocket up it. Take off with MyRepublic Unlimited Broadband at the fastest NBN speed available, up to 100 megabits per second for just $59.99 a month. Call MyRepublic now on 1300 GO FAST.
As one of the world's largest lubricant manufacturers, Total continues to set the global standard in lubricant research and development. That's why, unlike some of our competitors, Total has official lubricant approvals from vehicle and equipment manufacturers. Any oil company can say they meet vehicle manufacturers' requirements, but at Total, we go one step further. Talk to a Total expert today.
When the expected and unexpected pops up, you need the right pet insurance. RSPCA Pet Insurance helps protect your pet and your wallet from life's ups and downs. It's easy and affordable, with up to 80% of eligible vet bills reimbursed, and you can claim up to $11,000 a year with no excess. Plus, you'll be supporting the RSPCA. For a quick quote, call 139 300 or search RSPCA Pet Insurance.
Become inspired, become fulfilled, motivated, energized, strong body and mind. Become your dream, become proud, become real, become yourself, become a team, Become fun. Michelle Bridges' 12-week body transformation. Become you.
When you try a freshly made coffee at McCafe, you're enjoying Australia's most popular barista-made coffee. Just one of many reasons to try McCafe.
Life taught me to always have a clear vision. Realize timing is key. Be willing to push yourself. Trust technology to support you. But make sure you stay in control. And remember, the biggest competitor is yourself.
Welcome to the B-Team War Room. We are trying to understand the troop movements that are currently taking place around the planet that is increasing the threat level. The prospect of war is imminent. Malcolm Turnbull has made a very wise decision to keep our two battleships out of it altogether by faking a grease and oil change issue. Meanwhile, the two protagonists, Kim Jong-un is facing off against Donald Trump. God only knows what's going to happen when the Trump hits the fan. Join us for the B-Team this weekend. Fingers crossed.
This is AIM Agenda. With me this morning, Ben Oquist from the Australia Institute in Sydney and the former Howard Government Minister Peter McGauran. We've got you from Melbourne. Technical problem is fixed. Peter, first on this issue of good debt versus bad debt. Do you like what you're hearing from Scott Morrison on that?
Look, I am, because a lot of people do feel that in an era of low interest rates, governments should be borrowing and investing and providing a long-term benefit for the economy and for people. So I like it, and it gets us onto the debt issues. Let's face it, Australians have not been concentrating enough, let alone governments, on the debt issues that are plaguing our country and our casting a shadow over the future. So I like it. It's a very serious economic topic which plays to the government's strengths. Although, while they're referring to the debt issue, there's no suggestion that that debt will be reduced in broad terms. Rather, this seems to be giving them a bit of cover, albeit well-received cover by economists and others, including you two gentlemen this morning, for productive infrastructure. But still, the debt likely to not be reduced substantially as a result. Fair point, Kieran, but in actual fact, I think it's much more transparent. People will now be able to educate themselves, show an interest, put pressure on politicians as to what they see as debt that's necessary for an investment in the country's future, and debt which is perhaps being squandered on political promises, compromises, pork barrelling and the like. No, I think it actually puts more pressure on governments, and I would believe that was much of the motivation of the government in introducing this new separation of bad and good debt. Do you think that the government's guilty of hypocrisy, given how much it made of debt trucks in the past? I know Ben referred to the one that Malcolm Turnbull launched as opposition leader against Labor's ballooning debt. That's a little uncomfortable, I have to confess, Kieran, but time's moved on, and I think they're reshaping the debate and the future political landscape by this differentiation of bad and good debt. But look, no doubt about it, we played games in the past, we benefited from the whole debt of government, if you like, but I think they'll get away with it, to be honest. Well, as we've said, there's a very strong argument for taking on a fair bit of debt right now for that sort of spend. What do you think about the talk of infrastructure like the Melbourne to Brisbane freight link, the Western Sydney Airport, which suggestions this morning that if the Sydney Airport Corporation doesn't take up its option of building and running it, that the government will do it and own it and operate it? Is that a bit of a back to the future sort of approach? Well, in relation to your first question, I'd caution government against raising expectations and overhyping or overstating what can be done by way of infrastructure. I'm always wary of these railway line freight. You want to make it closer to home, if you like, more manageable, short-term construction and so on, which has an immediate impact. But in regard to Badgerys Creek, I think there is a problem there. It's quite clear Sydney Airport Corporation isn't going to invest. It's such a long term before you get your returns. It could be 20, 25 years. No, I think the federal government is stuck with Badgerys Creek. It's more than likely there'll be some form of government-private sector partnership, but the bulk of the funding, I'd be very surprised if it doesn't have to come from the government.
Okay, gentlemen, I want to conclude with a discussion on the Manus Island rampage that we saw by military personnel in PNG. This morning, an Afghan refugee was on ABC radio. This is a person whose identity wasn't disclosed, but apparently the individual at the centre of the claims made by Peter Dutton and others in this particular case.
I know how it feels for a child to be hungry, and when I see that, I cannot just close my eyes and not help. I told him I have food and fruit inside the centre. Would you like to come? And he said yes. I would like to go with you and get the fruit. It's a shame for Peter Dutton to say that. I did this child a favour. In other countries, is it shameful to help a poor child? In my country, it's respected, and we all do this. I just helped a child, but Peter Dutton took something else from it.
Ben Oquist and Peter McGoran, both of your thoughts on this one. Ben, to you, first of all, is Peter Dutton simply referring to information that he's been briefed on by his Department of Border Force and Immigration?
Let's call it as it is, Kieran. This is a deliberate plan, strategy by the Minister to demonise asylum seekers and refugees and sow big seeds of doubt in the Australian public's mind who, while they want the boat stopped, they don't like what's happening in Manus Island and Nauru. And the government is under big political pressure, despite the common perception that the government is popular because they're tough on boats. There is a huge unease in the Australian public about the situation on Manus and Nauru. 2,000 people who have been there years and years and years. The vast majority found to be genuine refugees. Let's call it as it is. The Minister is deliberately trying to...
you are right that this is a headache. This is a problem for the government. While it's worked, you know, they would argue it's worked as a deterrent. At the moment, it lingers. It is a blight on the government and our nation that these individuals remain in limbo there. There's no doubt about that. But how can you say definitively that this is an attempt to demonise when Mr Dutton says he's referring to official advice he's been given by his department?
Because we continually see the reports, and again the report this morning, that there was no incident. He's talking about people's fears that there may have been some incident, and how are we ever to know whether that's true or not. But the facts are that there was no such incident, and he should be stating that clearly, because whatever he doesn't, he demonises those individuals involved. And it's a deliberate strategy because it is a blight on the nation, and he knows that the Australian people think that, and he's attempting to sow seeds of doubt. It's a deliberate strategy that's been going on for a long time now, and he should put up or shut up. Those reports this morning again underscore there was no such incident, and it's a deliberate attempt to demonise asylum seekers.
Ben Oquist from the Australian Institute, thank you. We'll talk to you soon. Peter McGoran, continuing our discussion, what are your thoughts on how this has been handled? Ben's comments as well.
Kieran, I'd let the inquiry run its course now. I jumped out of bed this morning with a spring in my step because the nation is now focused on complex, difficult issues such as energy policy, and isn't the government riding a wild tiger there, but it has the courage to step in regard to guaranteeing domestic supply of gas. And then we've got the bad debt, good debt, which is going to create an economic debate. So I'm sorry, I just think this Manus Island issue, important as it is nowhere near as important as what should be the great public policy debates of our time, because there's arguments for and against what the government's doing, and full marks to them in seizing the political and economic agenda.
But it is still a serious... I know you spoke to Peter Dutton this week. It remains a major